All right, welcome everybody. It is Thursday, July 12th, 2018. You are in the Kubernetes SIG Architecture meeting, and my name is Jaice DuMars, not SIG Architecture as it may say in the thing there. So I am your host. I work at Google, and I will be hosting today's meeting. So the agenda, if you want to follow along, is available via bitlink, so bit.ly /SIG-architecture is where you'll find that. And we're going to go ahead and dig right in. So one of the things I have been working on is to try and create a way to track all of our work in a manner that is traceable and also prioritized. So people understand that not only do we have an agenda, but we also have ways to prioritize things on the agenda and track them over time. So the three main concerns that we're tracking right now, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here so everybody knows what I'm talking about. Let's see. So can people see that? Is that?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Let me pull up here. So this, in the agenda, you'll see this thing called KEP tracking review. And essentially what this does is it provides us a way to differentiate the tracking of KEPs from an administrative standpoint from the work to actually get the KEPs done themselves. So one of the problems we have across the project is that we have commingling of the project management part of things and also the actual technical discussions and content. So what I'm trying to do project-wide is to create a standard by which we can separate those two things out and actually have project management in Kubernetes, which is desperately needed. So I did this first for the steering committee backlog, and it seems like that's going to be very effective. And next is to try this with some of the things we're doing. So there are essentially three core projects here that we will be tracking. So API reviews, and that will be tying into the API review process. The KEP tracking, which is tied to the KEP process, and then conformance test review is simply a conformance test that we probably have a stake in and should understand the impact of those and if they're architecturally consistent, because conformance is one of our core concerns. So, so just moving along here, we're not going to go through this today, but in the future, I would like to quote unquote walk the board. If any of you have ever worked in an agile shop that had Kanban. You essentially just go through things that are in process and then look at how they're doing and what's in process. So, for example, with KEPs, if we're actually going to review one in SIG Architecture, somebody would hopefully drag that into column 3 here, which says need API or architecture review. So in the future, we will look those over. Joe.
So one of the things that I'd love to figure out here, and I think this is, so like one of the ideas, at least, I don't know if it's proven out, if we're doing it, is that check in early with the KEP so that we can actually make the technical discussions be isolated and we don't end up with these like issues that won't load, that never gets locked in, right? How does that mix with the idea that so much of the tracking stuff in GitHub is actually tracked by issues, right? By issues and by PRs. Right, because to some degree we want to track KEPs in terms of what state they're in, but that state is not represented by a PR. Now we may actually say, okay, if you want to get a review, submit a KEP to change the state from what is it, pending to implementable or whatever we decided on, which ends up being the sort of approval bit to some degree. Maybe that's the point where we review it, or maybe there's just a placeholder PR. That's some of the stuff that I'm wondering how you're thinking how that works.
Yeah, I'd imagine that if somebody makes a material change to a KEP, that essentially goes into the KEP tracking backlog as a new issue. Although these issues should essentially live for the life of the KEP. So we can do it either way. We can just move, so if something is over in progress and it gets stalled, we can potentially drag something back over to review or any of those things. So if we want to move, let's say,
okay, so these are essentially project tracking issues, not the PRs for actually getting the things in.
Correct. This is a completely project manager board. This is somebody who has no horse in the race in terms of what the KEP is doing. We're simply managing that if things need to be reviewed, somebody's got to do this and say, hey, wow, this thing needs to be looked at.
So these are kind of the parent issues for the stuff that's actually happening in the repo as stuff actually gets churned and discussed, right?
Exactly, yeah. So when somebody adds something new, we should be reviewing those and then moving them where their current state is. So these should live as long as the thing is merged or is being forked, and they appear even before they're really vetted. So it's one of those things where there may be a little bit of duplication of effort, but I'd rather have a little more cruft and we can sort through that than totally miss things.
No, sounds good. Sounds good. And by the way, I see that there's 2 14s there. I want to find time on a weekend at some point if we can get some and get a test and actually
there's more than 4. There's 1.
I know. It's
5, 6.
Yeah, and some of this is because we don't check in early, so these things hang around, and then when they do get checked in, nobody wants to actually sort of risk their thing by churning it. But what different issue?
Yeah, KEP 14 is my favorite.
Yeah,
all of them.
Funny thing is, Jordan, you're probably working on KEP 14. All of them. So here we can definitely easily see where there's duplication. I did put dupe after the ones that are duplicated, so that helps us figure that out. Okay, so then and so my grand vision, it may be totally aspirational or delusional. You can pick your adjective. Is to have all of our big level projects, and hopefully at the SIG levels, tracking in a similar manner, so that at any moment you can look at the major work being done by a SIG and understand where your thing is at in that as a SIG or as an individual. So that's something that I'm hoping will come to fruition over time. And by the way, this is something that should be applied to features as well, because features are long-lived and have states and all that stuff. So I'm going to push for this to be part of the release/feature process as well, so we stop having spreadsheets out there that people don't know about and don't update or are out of sync with GitHub. So let's make GitHub the record of note for everything that this project does and is important so that people can actually look at it. Okay, going back to the agenda. One last thing. This draft document here, take a look, give it a last once over. There's a few things that I need to address in it, but essentially this is the API review process that'll feed into that project board for API reviews. So we're getting good traction, got most of the LGTMs on the core stakeholders, which are the actual people who do the approvals. And there's a lot of commentary in here just to read over. If you have something, add it. I would request that if you have major sweeping changes, please don't, because this is really our first crack at this. And if there's things you want to bring up as aspirations for future process stuff, there is a section at the bottom called aspirations. So I would love to have anything that you see missing added here, as opposed to trying to knit the other sections. So
I just want to say, Jaice, thank you for pulling all this stuff together, both the review backlog boards and this API process. Thank you.
Yeah, glad to do it. And honestly, it's selfish because it makes my life easier.
It's the best sort of work.
Lazy sysadmin at work. Okay, so let's go back to the agenda. So we have our first item is brought to us by the esteemed Matt Farina. Do you want to take the helm there, buddy? Let me know what this is.
Sure.
Fantastic.
So thank you. So when Kubernetes 1.11 came out, there was generated code that was no longer checked into Kubernetes source. And folks who went and vendored Kubernetes to get to packages, say in the package directory, their stuff started breaking, and that caused problems for a handful of applications shortly after, as soon as they started to try to upgrade for 1.11. And so the question became, how should we handle this situation? Now, I know in the short term, we are working on taking that checked-in code and bringing it back into 1.11, hopefully .1. It does have a do not merge on it right now, but it is being
I
discussed.
approved it this morning. I don't know what the do not merge is still about.
That's being managed by the patch release branch manager. So
Okay.
they're just directing traffic on the branch.
Looks like it was just approved a minute ago.
Okay.
Okay, perfect. I asked about it and I haven't looked back. Okay, so there's that for that, but this does bring in the long-term implications that are probably worth us starting to discuss. Is Kubernetes meant to be vendored, or should everything that is venderable, basically all the packages, be moved elsewhere? I mean, we've started to do that with staging. This is going to have an impact on things like this. So like Vigo is moving forward, and Vigo assumes that everything will always hold to semantic versioning on the Go API, and nothing should ever break from it. You can never set things like a max range, like don't go higher than 1.11 or 1.12 when you're importing. It doesn't work for that because it assumes you will always never break semantic versioning. And we do that with our Go API in every minor release. We don't follow semantic versioning in the Go API, which means importing it with the direction of Vigo is even going to lead into future problems. So I wanted to raise the question of, how do we start handling these situations? Do we say not generated code in Kubernetes, but everything's out in staging elsewhere, and we keep the generated code there, so that way importers can, how do we just approach this situation? And if we're breaking from the Go community norms, then to be explicit about that, so that people who consume things can kind of have an idea of how they should do it. So anybody with opinions out there have thoughts?
So we've never said that Kubernetes was supposed to be venderable. We know it's not Go gettable, right?
Go as a language states out of the box, though, that everything Go and its public API is always Go gettable. So if we break from that convention, we should at least communicate to people that we're breaking from that convention so they know it, right?
That hasn't been true since 1.7, actually. 1.7 was when we stopped checking in everything that you needed to build. And you had to run make, and make would generate that.
Yeah, although I don't think that we should intentionally work in such a way that you can't work with us with the normal language stack. That if it's hard, and if the API changes, and if your code breaks, fine, some things are hard. But intentionally making it impossible to do because, we don't think you should do that, doesn't seem very community friendly.
So I don't think we're doing it for philosophical reasons. I think we're doing it for technical reasons. And those technical reasons are rooted in at least historical truth, which was checking in generated code was an enormous pain point for conflicts and for correctness. People who would run their tests against non-regenerated code and get passes and then upload it and it would fail against CI, right?
So I'm a fairly frequent contributor. I have found that the conflicts that I get are largely caused by Bazel. They are not caused by most of the other files. They occasionally happen. You occasionally have to regenerate, but it's not the problem it once was. So I'm looking at it saying it's a solution that doesn't really help me much on the development side, and it doesn't really help me much. It doesn't help me at all on the consumption side. I'm a consumer as well, right? Work for Red Hat. We have OpenShift. So it's a technical solution to a problem I don't seem to have.
Yep, and we're sort of rehashing the email thread, right? It's certainly not as dire as it once was. And so the question is, should we rethink the strategy? For the last 2 years, the general directional strategy has been to move generated code out of the checked-in set. Do we need to reevaluate that?
So I would just like to jump in that the Go standard is that generated code is checked in, or unless that shifted a little bit to automatically calling Go generate and doing it that way. If it's something we can reevaluate, should we look at following along with what Go intends and what Go developers expect?
I saw Matt's hand up. Was that the same thing, Matt?
That's what I was the one who just said that.
Sorry.
Yeah, I saw Jordan's.
I saw Jordan's hand up.
I was just going to say, to your earlier point, Tim, that some of the stuff we have moved out of the repo, like documentation and stuff doesn't generate anymore.
Yep.
In repo, it generates out. Some stuff we stopped generating altogether. So we switched from like UGORG to dynamic JSON.
That was probably the single biggest change we made.
Yeah. David, I think there are two files that are not being checked in. One is the OpenAPI file. I think if we started checking that one in again, that would quickly become the biggest conflict. But that to me seems like a problem with that specific file. Like the whole repo combines into one file.
Yeah, that generator is bad.
Per version files. So I think we could probably address those two files and make them not be conflict targets. And if that would make life better for people getting the repo and building it with standard Go tooling, that doesn't seem bad.
So are we talking about the Swagger file?
There are two files I'm aware of. One is the bin data, and one is the OpenAPI generated spec, like this mega spec file.
Yeah, but it's JSON, right?
No, it's a Go file that gets generated.
Okay.
And it really does look like one where you would want to split it into pieces, one per API group, and then work off of that.
I mean, it was that way actually at some point. It used to be that way, and then it was moved into a single file, and I forget the reasons for it.
I don't have a clear memory.
So I feel like this is one of those issues that there's kind of opinions on both sides, and it seems a little bit hard to reconcile. How do we actually get to a point where we can make this decision?
Like Tim said, I think the original reason for moving away from it was pragmatic. It was these things were rebase magnets, and it was slowing down project velocity. And so if it really is just a couple files, and we can make those workable and not reintroduce those rebase problems, it seems like that would be worthwhile. Another alternative could be that once we cut a release branch, we check in the generated files, because at that point velocity slows tremendously. That's not exactly the best solution in my mind, but it would certainly solve the I'm bumping to the next version of Cube and I want to vendor it. If someone wants to vendor from master, I feel less bad about them having to run development style processes, but I don't know. What do people think?
I mean, another option would be to say, can we break out anything that people are likely to vendor into separate repositories that are go-gettable, the staging evolution, and leave the generated stuff as you really don't want to vendor this. I don't know if that's really practical or not. There's a lot of generators.
So,
Ken.
So I mean, if we were toward it, we could definitely make package vendorable. Like we could make it go-gettable. And if we spend the effort to do that, what's the win? What's the benefit? I mean, is that something that we really want people to be vendoring? Like, generally, isn't the idea that you'd want people to use a client generated off of the OpenAPI spec or the vendored Go client in order to interface with the system as opposed to vendoring out individual components?
Well, I'm going to jump in here. That really depends on what you're trying to do. Those aren't the only bits that people want to use or are using in practice. And so we shouldn't assume which parts of the package people want to use. I'm sorry, I think I jumped on
David Eads,
David there. Sorry.
Yeah. So again, I depend on a lot of pieces inside of Cube. I think there is a difference between Cube saying, here's the thing that you should use. We will maintain compatibility on this, or we will feel bad if it is really hard for you to use something like Client Go. And we won't feel bad if it is a little hard or the API keeps changing if you vendor something from Cube package. There's a difference between saying that and saying, you know what? We're flat out making it impossible for you to vendor this without you going through and then changing the code, running a build on our local system, generating the files, and then carrying shims that you can't use with standard vendoring tools like Glide or Dep. And removing the generated code says the latter, not the former. So
Right. Right, it does. So my question is, if we put in the effort in order to, again, make it vendorable, what use cases are we supporting? So if you vendor out of controllers, for instance, or if you vendor out of kubelet, and you try to build a stable product on that, you're probably going to be in a world of hurt no matter what.
Built a stable product on it, ran it for years.
Was it fun?
And it's not zero energy.
Yeah, it's not zero energy. Like there's a LOE there no matter what you're going to do. And I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. I just think that we should be clear on the use cases that we want to support before investing effort in doing it. And then put some thought around it.
Jordan, you want to take it instead of me?
I was just going to say that checking in artifacts so you get a reproducible build without depending on a lot of project-specific build infrastructure, I think has value. So if you can get the Go source and run Go build and get a build, I think that has value. Yeah.
So we got Matt and then Tim.
Well, I was just going to say, we are having this conversation because things that aren't in client generated are already being used by people in their applications. It's not whether they should or shouldn't. It's that the state of the world is today, people are doing it and they're dealing with the upgrade of Kubernetes versions to keep this stuff going. That's the state of the world, and they found useful things in there and they found processes to make it work. That's kind of the state of the world today. And the question is if we're not going to support them, we're saying we're not supporting part of the community who's doing this. And we should say, maybe we're going to change the support and you need to use a different route to do those same things. But I mean, part of the community is doing this today. Just as is, that's the reason this whole conversation came up. When some generated files went out, everyone went, my stuff broke, we're having issues. I need to get this done. And so it highlighted from a real world concern. So let's think about how we move forward from where we're at rather than what people should or shouldn't do, because that gets philosophical. I'd like to maybe keep it practical to solutioning for people.
And it's also not the case that we're trying to add things to make it easier. It's the case that people are actively spending energy to make it harder. And so...
Tim.
Well, they're not spending energy to make it harder. Making it harder is a side effect of spending energy on other goals.
Yeah.
So I agree sort of fundamentally with what Jordan said before. If we can have a reproducible build, then why wouldn't we? Historically, the problems, I think, were twofold, at least as I perceived them. One was the constant need for rebases. That has not gone away, as Jeff, I don't know if Jeff's on the call, Jeff did some analysis on the thread and showed that some of the top couple of rebase targets are still ZZ generated dots stuff, though the numbers are much smaller than they used to be. So there was the problem of the rebases. Maybe we could solve it with respect to Open API. Somebody needs to go figure that out, and bin data. The other part of the problem was that people would forget to regenerate it, and they would push their code up, and then they would get reminded that they have to push their stuff, and they would invalidate all their testing. I've seen that from the reviews that I've been doing. I've seen that get better since running make automatically regenerates. People don't need to remember to run hack update generated star, and so that's been better. So honestly, if we moved more of the generators, there's I think 4 or 5 left that aren't in that same mode, move them to a place that automatically rebuilds when you type make or when you type Bazel, right, Jeff? And leaves those artifacts in your tree so that when you run git commit -a, you see, hey man, I got these changed files. That might be enough for me, honestly.
Well, so whatever we decide here, we're going to have to fund with people actually doing this, because the sad part is that Matt's concern about this actually giving us a black eye in the community is whether people are doing the right thing or the wrong thing for their projects is something that we kind of need to address. So I'm a big fan of putting something in place that's a little more immediate and less effort to at least kind of address this.
Well, we reverted the bin data change, and has anybody really complained about the Open API change?
Like I said, that's been that way since 1.7.
Exactly.
So,
yeah. So what I would say is if we can summarize what we want to do in the meeting agenda notes, there's a a bolded thing there that says decision under this topic. If you are passionate about actually doing the work and not just talking about the work, whoever that is in this assemblage of people, put something down there and let's figure out how to actually make that happen. And looks like Ken and Jeff both raised their hands at the same time.
Jeff can go first.
Okay, I just want to, I guess, highlight, I think there's like two subtly different issues here that we should probably make sure we tackle both. One is, do we want people, like, how much do we want to support vendoring Kubernetes to Kubernetes? It sounds like we want to continue vendoring Kubernetes to Kubernetes, and so we need to make that very clear. And, you know, there's parts we don't. Maybe we should be using internal or make it very clear which pieces are not supposed to be. And the other question, which is related but slightly different, is what do we want to do about generated code? And so those, I think, are kind of different things. We should probably decide them slightly differently. They're related, but not exactly the same thing.
Okay, I'm breaking those out as separate things.
I think there's a third thing that we should also think about. So taking one example directly, apply. So apply is something that was really popular either to vendor directly out of Kubernetes. I believe Helm was doing that for a while, and strategic merge patch is another thing that's very popular. So rather than make that more easily vendorable, we decided to move it to server-side functionality, right? So we identified something inside of the community that people really wanted to use and tried to move it server-side. If there are things that, as we try to make things vendorable, if we're going to break this down and say these are things that we really want to vendor, and we're going to take other things and make them internal and say you really shouldn't be vendoring those, we should probably try to look across the community and see what people are actually vendoring and make a decision about whether those are things that we might want to move server side as well.
That's a great point. I think we should, if we're going to go this route, and I'm okay with it. I say that as somebody with the PR that deletes all the generated code from all the other generators. I'm okay with the idea. We should discourage people from vendoring Kubernetes. We should figure out what it is that they're vendoring and either, like Ken said, move them server side or just move them to other staging repos and let people vendor them from top level repos like that, which is a little bit of a segue into a later topic on today's agenda, which is the creation of new staging repos for components and component configs, which I'm a fan of. I don't think we should go out of our way to make any guarantees about stability within Kubernetes. If somebody's vendoring package kubelet something, and I move that to staging kubelet, I think that's a legit change. And if they're vendoring it, I don't care if I broke them. I do care if we actually made it impossible for them to work correctly.
Matt?
I just wanted to add two things here. One is, you know, many tools, just like Kubernetes versions, support multiple versions of Kubernetes. So even when we move apply server side for a version, before somebody can truly count on that in some of their tools, they might have to wait for a couple more releases of Kubernetes and compatibility across before they can even drop handling it internally if they're trying to do that multi-version support, which many tools actually try to do. And so it's not as simple as just saying, well, we moved it server side, now somebody's case is immediately handled, because there's that transition period, right? And then I just also want to say, I like the idea of moving this stuff out to smaller bite-sized repos. Vendoring Kubernetes is incredibly painful, and I wish we didn't have to do that in any of the tools I ever touched. In fact, we try to use the staging repos like Client Go and otherwise every place we can, just so we can see when we can finally someday have everything out of it and we don't need it anymore, because it would be really nice. And so I'm in favor of moving things into smaller, more bite-sized repos and making that much simpler.
So I'll put out a plea for all the people who are vendoring Kubernetes or dealing with tools that do vendor Kubernetes. Help us figure out what the smaller bite-sized repos would actually look like. We've got a few already. We've got package utils got moved out to Kubernetes utils, and we've been moving out, you know, a lot of the API machinery and stuff is already moved out. And again, to segue into the later topics, I'm proposing that we move out all the major components into separate staging repos. That doesn't leave a ton that's left.
Okay, so I'm going to go back to our decisions, which there are two in the agenda. Please, if you're willing to sign up to actually help this, I would actually recommend that we don't try and tackle the smaller repo thing immediately, simply because that's going to be a tremendous amount of work, and overhead. If we can do it some other way to start, at least to get some traction, that would be good.
Well, we're rolling back the major pain point, right? So we're back to the same level of discomfort that we were at before 111.
Right.
And I would be fine just keeping it there.
Okay. Tim, and then let's move on to the next agenda item after this.
My only request is like a requirement if we're going to make any of these types of changes to add things to staging is that somebody manage the DAG for the dependency graph between these things, because if you touch anything inside of KK, namely anything related to testing, it's literally like a buckyball. You pull one strand, you touch everything else. So if it's clear to define the DAG, if somebody's going to do this work, it should be a requirement to like say, like, here are all the dependent libraries that will be associated with said sub element. And usually that will go into that separate repo if they have the glide lock file or whatever.
Okay. Thank you for raising that. That's super important. Okay, moving along. Matt, this is the next one is yours. If we can try and keep this short, that would be great.
Hopefully this can be short. The process says that any new repositories need to go through SIG architecture approval. There's a link to the issue right there for anybody who wants to do it, and this is a shared process thing. Under the Kubernetes org, we've already created for the doc site the Chinese translation one, and now wherever it's at, there's a Chinese translation repo somewhere, and so now, if I could remember the name of it, yeah, Kubernetes docs -zh is how it is. Here is the existing one for Chinese, and now the docs team is requesting the same thing for Korean and Japanese, who already have internationalization teams who want to work on this stuff and are already doing it, just not under the Kubernetes org.
Any objections? Speak now or forever shut the hell up. Approved.
Great. Putting it in the notes. Architecture 712. Cool. Right. Thank you for bringing that up, Matt. And let's go ahead and go on to the next thing. Tim.
So there's a proposal from Lucas. I don't think he's here. I think he's actually joining the Army this week. But Finnish requires the Army. He's proposing to move the various component config definitions out from the sort of buried places that they're in each place around the code base today. They're kind of a mess, into a single, more accessible place that is more easily vendored. See earlier topic. His initial proposal was to create a new component config repo. Discussion on the doc led to the idea that maybe we should create per component repos under staging and start the process of actually encouraging kubelet, kubeproxy, kubectl, everything else to actually exist in staging repos that could be split out into bite-sized chunks the same way that API machinery and other things are. I like the idea, and I would like to encourage it. So I second the motion to create staging kubelet, kubeproxy, et cetera, and put the config files under there. For now, config might be the only thing under there, but it gives us a way to start testing and we're moving towards separate repos for these components.
David, and then Jordan.
What is the distinction between these APIs that we are going to serialize on disk and the Kubernetes API that we serialize both on disk and into etcd? Why would they not live together?
The distinction to me is the Kubernetes APIs are independent of any particular implementation. It is at least hypothetically possible that somebody could implement Kubernetes entirely from scratch using those API definitions, and they would be fine. The kubelet component config is really related to this particular implementation of kubelet. It's not part of the user-facing API. So to me, it's different.
But if I were to create my own kubelet and accept a compatible version of the config, to help people transition, that seems like a perfectly legal thing.
Sure, and you would vendor kubelet, you'd vendor kates.io kubelet config, as opposed to vendoring all of kates.io APIs, ...
I can see smoke coming out of your ears, David.
Not a satisfying answer. I see Tim with his hand up.
Yeah, actually, Jordan had the floor first, and then Tim.
Sorry.
I just wanted to raise something that was discussed in the doc. As far as having a kubelet repo with config underneath it, as opposed to a kubelet repo and a kubelet config repo. And I think one of the idea was to make the external config formats that the kubelet consumes able to be vendored and dealt with by people who are wanting to produce config to feed into a kubelet or whatever component. And if I understand it correctly, some of the vendoring tools support vendoring just a subpackage and others do not. Do we know what Vigo and dep would do with something like that? Would you be able to vendor just the config subdirectory of a kubelet and not pull in all the dependencies of the kubelet?
Who knows Vigo best, Matt?
The
Yeah,
last
that's
time
Robert's point in the chat was the same thing as mine.
Yeah, so dep is only going to walk the package tree that is currently called in use to look for dependencies. It's not going to grab anything that's not being called in your code. The last time I looked at Vigo, I thought it looked at all the dependencies of a module, not just the package tree that was called. I could be wrong on it, and I hope somebody would go investigate it. But yeah, I thought it was at the module level it would pull in the dependencies.
So we could conceivably declare the config portion of it as a module, correct? Because a single repo can contain multiple modules nested at different levels.
Okay.
That's my understanding too, but I haven't played with Vigo since the early days.
I haven't looked at it in a while either, so I could be very wrong in this.
I feel like if somebody's passionate about this, we should go into the investigation part of this and actually find out, just to be safe.
Okay.
Do we agree that one of the goals is for people to be able to
Yes.
just vendor the config bits? So
I agree with that.
okay.
Absolutely, that's the primary use case, actually.
So let's make sure that nesting it this way would work, at least with dep and Vigo. If it required us to do a submodule or declare a nested module for just the config bits.
That's good. I'll throw that comment in the doc.
I love this effort, but I'd also want to stress that for a number of releases, both Lucas, myself, and a number of other people on SIG Cluster Lifecycle have been trying to push the component config to be a more supported item across the project to no avail. If the goal is to treat this as an external consumable, as if it were almost an API type, can we at least get some sort of buy-in from the project to push this towards more maturity so it can be consumed by folks in the community? Because there has been a long-standing desire to get these component configs to a state of maturity that we can consume for doing automated provisioning.
I don't think anybody disagrees that it's valuable. I think it's just not high enough priority on anybody's agenda to finish some of the things that mostly just work and aren't really actual pain points.
I agree. Robert mentioned the kubelet. So the kubelet config did actually go to beta. So it is out of alpha. It was paving the way in some ways, serving as a warning in other ways. Scheduler is probably the next closest. It has an alpha level config file today. I think getting these in the right place, both so that the Go types can be vendored the way we want them to be, and then maturing the alpha to beta, beta to GA is the roadmap here.
Also, like, I never touched kubeproxy because I wanted to wait for kubelet to actually like plow the field first.
Yeah.
Yeah. So on the separate versus together, so we're probably going to want to make sure we have relatively reasonable API review processes around these. Not quite the same level of the kube ones, but these are APIs. They have to deal with backwards compatibility. They have to deal with forwards compatibility. they should reasonably follow a set of conventions that may slightly diverge from the core APIs. But for a couple of those reasons, focusing attention can often have better outcomes. For the same reason that we put all the Kube APIs together, there's potentially reasons that everything that kubeadmin might want, for instance, should be reasonably consistent. So there's some level of human-wise concentrating these versus separating them might bear dividends.
I seem to recall the API review doc as it stands actually includes these explicitly.
Yeah,
that's correct.
One of the nice things about the config APIs is that you don't have the same round tripping problems as you do where you have to let arbitrary clients write them and other arbitrary clients read them and write them and read them and write them. Right. They're consumed by a single, the target is a single component, which is nice.
Yeah, I just meant that they are subject to the same process, not necessarily the same standards.
Yep.
Cool. So let's go ahead, and unless there's anything else here that people want to talk about. By the way, the action item here, Tim, end of the decision, if you could add a little more descriptive language to the decision, that would be super helpful.
All right.
About vendor config bits. So
will do.
Great. And then actually, you're up next, and then we're going to move on to Hippie Hacker for APISnoop.
Okay. I'm worried that this could take up the rest of the time, and
okay.
I'm happy to punt this to next session if we have to.
Okay, let's go through APISnoop real quick, Hippie Hacker, and then we'll go to the last one if we have time, at least start the conversation.
Thanks for that. I dropped a link to the PR in the chat, and it's also available in the docs. Rather than share my screen, I'll drop a link to the KEP itself and the summary and kind of walk through it a little bit. One of the reasons we're doing this from the conformance working group perspective is to really understand what is being used by the community so we can prioritize what needs to be tested, as well as getting some confirmation around what we test is actually what is being used. So I'll just just a shout out to New Zealand and the Maori here, the culture of the mihi and the whakapapa, as far as their really core concepts of identity, kind of influence this. Right now, when our applications talk to one another, they just say, "Hey, I'm this little. Here's my user agent string. I'm Mozilla. I built it this time, right?" So when they get together, there's a protocol, and the protocol says, "Hey, my people arrived here on this particular canoe, and here's my ancestry all the way back to here, and this is why I'm here today." This conversation allows identifying the relationships within the community, because we know there's things to correlate. So if we look through, what I would like to do is enable any application really simply to just answer that question: why are you here? Why do you think you're here? And what are you wanting from me, as far as from the API server's perspective? I go through a bit of, there's some overarching APISnoop goals, which are not part of the KEP, but they're definitely the reason why the KEP exists. I can go through that. One thing is, I'll go back to the goals for the APISnoop afterwards. But we'd like to be able to do this cluster-wide for every binary that uses any of our official libraries. And what that looks like, if we go on to the proposal itself, is really three things. What does it mean to ask the question, who are you and why are you here? What is your identity and purpose? What does it codified look like? And how do we suggest the creation of that at the time of the API interaction? And then thirdly, how do we collect this information and aggregate it for the entire cluster? And as we do it across our community to create a large data set for machine learning and whatnot, what's the method for that aggregation? Under API aggregation, API identity, I'm going to drop a link there. These are the more technical bits. Right now, we say, here's our application and version and architecture and the commit, which is great. But things like the Linux kernel include the timestamp and the who built it. So we have a little more information about that particular binary and where it came from. If we go a little bit further on to the purpose, this is more in line with the Whakapapa and the mihi. So the mihi is actually the transmission of that identity, and this link of the call stack and submitting it with each API interaction would provide some really interesting data down to each line of code in every piece of every application within our community, and be able to cross-reference that with the response and request response and look for patterns there. And it seems pretty straightforward. All of our languages that we support introspection, and I'm just suggesting we find a way to enable communicating that essentially. This last one is how do we communicate it? User agent has previously been limited to various sizes. We actually got a PR through to create and record that in audit logging, and initially it didn't have a limit, and I was able to create the data set that I'm going to link to right now. But we put that at 1K because it's a traditional limit. But I wanted to suggest we look at other cultures may have longer definitions of identity, or we may find a better way in protocol to gather this information, and that's why I wanted to put this forward as an enhancement proposal. And the last little bit is how do we tie this all together, and how do we turn this on? My suggestion is that we make modifications to client Go and support a variable that says, hey, do something different. Tell us a little more about yourself. Tell me who you are and why you're here. And this could be enabled for all of the Kubernetes binaries as they're deployed, and also with an admission or initialization controller for all the applications within the cluster. And gathering that could be via audit logging. The dynamic webhook would be great, but we're currently doing it statically, and we could aggregate that similar to how Sonobui has a URL and says, hey, would you like to audit your cluster? And here's the URL, and here's your report, so that eventually we have a community-wide, large aggregated data set to really have some deep insight into what our community is actually doing. I'm looking for feedback to see, is this a good approach or not? I'm looking for sponsorship. I need a SIG architecture or SIG testing sound like appropriate ones, but I'm gonna open it up now to discussion and feedback.
Yeah, so Clayton put a thing in the comments that says it sounds a lot like distributed tracing, and basically try to differentiate that. And since there's already prior art there and whatnot, if you want to just discuss overlaps, differentiations between this and say open tracing or whatever. So
I can speak to open tracing because Wojtek and I went down this road, and it's a epic failure because of the watch mechanics of how Kubernetes works. You can lose tracing insights across the watches, so we actually punted completely on it. Both Merrick, myself, and Wojtek spanned 2 releases trying to make this work, and came up to the point where distributed tracing falls over across the watch semantics inside of it because it's not a microservice-based system.
Yeah, but this wouldn't apply to watches, really. I mean, it would, like, I'm watching to fill a cache, but all the other calls would be distributed tracing style calls, like the RPC style interactions. I guess I'm asking, so just to ask my question, this looks like a somewhat novel way of passing contextual information along with API requests. There's already a lot of patterns for that. Why is this not more structured like that? If we did a request ID for requests and it came from clients and there were client identifiers, what's the difference?
And for me, I'm trying to make it simple for everyone that has existing clusters to be able to enable it. So we can see what real-world information looks like. In the same way that we can run quickly to enable Sonobui, and Sonobui provides a conformance test to say what is this cluster Kubernetes conformant or not. I want something that simple that anyone in our community can go click on a URL and say, I would like to contribute this cluster's data to APISnoop. I click on the URL, do a kubectl apply, and it's there. I didn't find an easy path within different tracing methods that would not create a level of complexity that would work as simply as this approach.
Jordan.
Yeah, I'll be honest. I don't really want to collect and be responsible for this level of data coming from clients, including stack traces from who knows what with paths and like data through to a server and then out to another collection point. That, to me, that both from the information exposure perspective and from a risk of this becoming a bad API. If you want an API server to react differently or respond differently, if it sees a request that has a specific application in the stack trace or a specific version, there was some discussion of trying to enable use of user agents to do things like this years ago. This was something with a particular version of kubectl and wanting to adapt the API server to be able to react to user agents in a particular way. And to me, that sounds like an unstructured API that I don't want to support.
Yeah, I have my own concerns about opt-in on this because it feels like a lot of groundwork that's going to be applied for something that we don't have a real understanding about what the opt-in would look like, nor the opt-out. I'm also a little worried about expanding the size of user agent for a number of reasons, scale and other concerns that might have deleterious effects across large clusters, and these are just things that have to be ferreted out over time. But I feel like there's some relatively significant concerns about that.
I think the idea of improving visibility to the source of API calls is interesting and something that would probably be useful in our client libraries. I'm curious how far we could get with enabling that tracing locally and then submitting like an audit ID or a request ID that you could then correlate.
Yeah. I did look into ways to try to augment the cluster to cluster wide and trying to gather all of those logs and bring them together, and it seemed like a lot of overhead on the other side. My thought was to try to, if we want to simplify it, we could try to make it smaller and have it be a hash, and that was, if you go down in the maybe it's in alternatives or risks and mitigation. So that we can, we'd have to find a way to automatically create these hashes later to compare them so that we'd have them available. If you were to, for example, for each of the lines inside of the call trace, you could put those down to a hash. So you could identify this sequence of the call stack and be able to map that later so that it was a smaller piece of information as far as the size. Yeah, let's table it.
Yeah, I think we're going to do it a disservice by having a truncated discussion on this. What I would say is, let's put this on the mailing list for SIG architecture and have a more thorough discussion there. I think the provisional decision that I'm hearing is that I think people are cautiously curious, but I don't feel like we're in alignment about this being something that the SIG should necessarily rally around to sponsor. Is there anybody who's on the call right now who feels differently than what I just said? All right. Yeah, send it to the mailing list. I appreciate, just personally, I appreciate the level of diligence you've applied to these KEPs. It's much higher, and I also like the fact that you're bringing in cultural and other concerns to these things, because I think that's something sometimes that gets lost or missing. So I think that's a really interesting and valuable thing to add to the discussion. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Jaice.
Okay, wow, this has been a dynamite meeting. Thank you everybody for attending and your patience and participation. I will see you in 1 week, and have a great week. Tim, you're on mute. I don't know if you're saying something to us, but okay, wait.
Sorry. I want to talk about the next topic of pluralization. I will be out next week, and the week after, and the week after that. So maybe why don't I start a thread on the mailing list instead of putting it on the next week's agenda?
That sounds great. I'm going to be gone next week as well, so we'll figure it out. And hopefully you're going and doing some cool things, Tim.
We'll see.
All right. Well, hopefully. All right. Take care, everybody. Have a good one.
Bye.
Bye.